It's not required. You just do it on the first come first served basis. So most students will be allocated 20 minutes per person, and then if you have other questions, you have to rejoin the queue. Then for face-to-face consultation, now for mid-February to mid-April, our last lecture, I think it's on the 18th of Feb, something like that. So you are on your own for about 2 months or 1.5 months, plus and minus. So what I'm doing is I'm setting aside every Thursday, 6 o'clock, for consultation. So for this consultation, you need to pre-book. So what you do is you just text me on every Tuesday, the timing, and grab a seat at the tables outside level 5 in block B. And once you're there, just text me the exact venue, then I'll come and look for you. So that will be for lasting about 6 to 7 weeks, while we don't have lectures. And I'm still trying to iron out online consultation. I will be most probably doing Skype and using a software to do online demonstration. But the issues for online consultation is not fully confirmed. So I'll let you know probably by next week. So you could see we are almost at the 3/4 mark of the race. You have to run faster. Then at the same time, you also must know you must readily seek help. You cannot stay there in your dark room and let the room get darker. You have to sort out your concepts, try out exercise question, and lots of opportunity for you to ask questions. So don't copy this. This is available on my Google Drive, so I hope you make an effort to check your Google Drive periodically. So there's class, test 2, assignment 2, tutorials, as well as consultations. So with that, let's continue from where we ended in the last lecture. So we were actually doing tutorial 3. If you hear me carefully, I make mention that students must make an attempt to do tutorial. There are 5 tutorials in our syllabus, and tutorial 2 to 5 are, in fact 2 to 4 are very important. Tutorial 2 was on Solo's growth model. Tutorial 3 primarily ISLM closed economy, and tutorial 4 would be open economy. So make sure you spend and invest the time in it. So our last week we already finished question 1 and 2. So these are very popular questions on money market. There tends to be a question on money demand, and 1 question on money supply. So it's a very focused discussion. While it's a very focused discussion, you should not simply merely just use general statements. You must use your economics model. So for question 1, you use Keynes money demand. Question 2, you have to use the money multiplier. So today we're going to finish off in the first half of the lecture on the short question, then we will move on to section B. So look at the next type of question, primarily question 3, 5, and 6. They were primarily on the LM curve. Now, you must know one thing, that when I set tutorial, I deliberately pick tricky questions. I don't want big, easy questions to give you a wrong impression that the topic is easy. So if you try out the questions, you don't find that as easy as you thought. It's normal. It's meant to be tricky. So looking at these questions, they were all on the LM. Question 3 is on the slope. Question 5 is on the shift. And question 6 is again on the slope. So when we actually discuss the LM, we have to make a decision whether to use graphical or mathematical approach. But if you look at question 3, you can't do graphical approach at all. It's primarily mathematical approach. So for question 3, we have to re-derive the entire function. So every time when you read the question, you always recall your main concept. Look at your standard money demand first. Which you know is H0 plus H1y minus H2i. And you also know the slope of this money demand is primarily 1 over H2. You also know, using this money demand, the slope of LM is generally H1 over H2. So we don't plunge into the question first. We don't say, oh, the question says money demand depends on consumption. I start doing and answering the question. You actually recall what you know first so that you're able to compare. So you have the standard slope of money demand, and I also write out the standard slope of LM because the question says LM is steeper or flatter. So this will be my reference point for me. Right? Okay? Then now look at the revised money demand. Alright? The question says instead of writing income, now you should actually write in a H1Y. Okay? Instead of H1Y, you should write in a consumption C0 plus C1 Y minus T. So you merely replace the income function by a consumption function, then minus a H2I. Alright, and for convenience, you may want to assume T is 0, or if you didn't, at least assume a lump sum tax. Alright, because now consumption function we know, alright, has the tax component. So it's up to you. Remember, assumptions is in your hands. Right? So if you didn't know, you can assume T to be 0, then at least assume a lump sum tax. And therefore, right, our revised money demand, let's call this MD over P prime. Again, we group all the constants together. Alright, so in this case, you could see you will have H0 plus H1 C0. These are all fixed values. Okay, then we left with H1 C1Y. Okay, and with H2I, because I assume tax to be 0. So I write out my consumption function, and I plugged into the money demand function. Right, then again I can see, if I were to rewrite it, okay, the slope of money demand is still 1 over H2. Right, because to know the slope of money demand, I must look at the coefficient in front of interest rate. So this gives me a sense that money demand, the slope is not affected, but I don't jump to conclusion. Alright, so from here, therefore I derive, right, the revise, should I say LM? So money supply equals money. Okay, so money supply, put in your M over P, money demand, you have that whole chunk. Okay, so I'm going to skip a few steps. Eventually, you will get I equals to H0 plus H1 C0 minus M over P over H2. Right? Then you will get H1 over H2 times C1. This is the final equation you will get. Right, and you can see in this case the slope of LM is C1 times H1 over H2. Right, so I have a sense that money demand, the slope is not affected, but I don't jump to conclusion. Right, I actually derive my LM. Remember, derivation of LM is money supply, M over P, this is your money demand. So rearranging them. Okay, this term here, H1 over H2 times C1Y. So this term here would be the slope. So what examiner wants to test you is to compare. Alright, this is the key answer. Since C1 is usually less than 1. Right, remember according to Keynes, MPC is always less than 1. So therefore it tells us C1 H1 over H2 is therefore smaller than H1 over H2. So that tells us the LM is flatter. Right, and therefore the statement is false. So it is not a difficult question. Right, it's a very systematic approach where you actually derive the new LM function. But when you get the slope, you're supposed to compare with your standard slope. Alright, and you know, based on Keynes, because the entire discussion is on Keynes' model. Keynes says MPC is always less than 1. So we are able to affirm that the LM is. So we don't need to really draw. Okay, it's difficult to draw the new money demand. You may not know how it actually looked like. But instead, we will do mathematical approach. Right? But very quickly, let me show you, despite the question was easy, students can do really ridiculous things to earn 0 marks. Alright, so let's see how you can earn a 0 mark. There are students nearly, alright, they just state slope of Lm is h1 over h2. So they read the question. They know the question must discuss slope, so they state the slope. And the next thing they do is they state that the slope did not contain C. Alright? They didn't actually explain the money demand function whatsoever. They really only look at the end part of the question and say the slope didn't contain consumption. And therefore, slope not affected. And this is the answer. 3 lines. This kind of answer will definitely get 0 from the examiner. Alright, so you can't do that. You cannot just go to the end of the question, take the concept, and say the cause is not inside the effect. You can't do that. Alright, there must be some level of analysis, so make sure you don't fall into this trap. Okay, now the second type of students is quite worrying. The question was, money demand depends on consumption. Instead, the student went to say, consumption is C0 plus C1, alright, money demand minus T. Right, they changed the question. Instead of saying money demand depends on consumption, their question become consumption depends on money demand. And they use it to derive IS. And they went to discuss slope of IS. Alright, so while you're seated there, you might think, how can it be? But there are. Alright, okay, in the past I do set this as a test question. I have students who do this. They can walk out of the test and confidently say, oh, I think I can earn 3 out of 5, but not checking at all. The cause and effect were totally wrong. Alright, and then they say the statement definitely false because it will affect slope of IS and not LM. Alright, so we don't just want to know the correct answer, we also want to learn from the ridiculous answers. Don't commit this kind of mistakes, especially the first mistake. Some of you might think that, hey, I did answer the question, but you actually never analyze at all. You merely look at the slope and say it didn't contain consumption, that's all. Alright, so these are very terrible answers, but right, if you look at the question is actually not difficult. It's purely mathematical approach, and you have to do it very systematically. Okay, and some of you, if you have lump sum tax T bar, then you will have a H1 C1 T bar inside this term here. Alright, so it's better to assume taxes to be 0. So every time when you start the question, look at your assumptions. Do you need them to simplify the entire answer? So that was question 3. Okay, now with that, let's look at question 5.